Hello and welcome to session 9 of our 12-part novel writing programme, Every Character Has a Story. My name is Sarah Hull and I'm the Creative Director for Writers Essentials. This session will pick up where the last one left off and we'll look at how plot and character intertwine. So going on from the last session, don't worry if you find it difficult to follow. There was a lot in there and structure is one of the most difficult things to wrap your head around and get right, especially if you're writing something as long as a novel. But it's also essential that it's done well. Otherwise, a story will never really get going, or it'll sag in the middle, or it'll just fall over. The fundamental idea is to break your book down into chapters, scenes, paragraphs, lines, and even words in order to tease out the weaknesses that stop it being a good book and you being a successful author. This is a structure template I use. Try summarising what happens in each chapter in the novel. What are the events or developments? Then break each chapter down into scenes and summarise what happens in each scene under its own heading. To practice, try doing this for a book you know well before applying it to your own novel. Or take a look at the examples of chapter-by-chapter breakdowns available to download via the website. I then recommend identifying the 6 key aspects we looked at last week, which make up the central storyline. These are the norm, the catalyst, the objective, the obstacle or obstacles, the climax and the resolution, and making sure they work as they should. You can then pick out the key events, the things the protagonist does or that are done to him or her that form a path between the establishing of the objective and the climax, when the protagonist is successful or not in achieving their objective. As I mentioned before, these things should move the story on by directly showing the protagonist getting closer or further away from their goal, form a carefully linked chain so they follow on from one another, be numerous and sufficiently well placed throughout the novel to give it a good pace, and they should also be external events, so that if another character were present, they would be able to see something happening, and I'll come back to that later. These are the events which make up the main story, the protagonist's story. But there will be other characters in your novel, and they will each have a story of their own. As we looked at in session 4, living, breathing characters, every one of your characters should be well developed and individual. They should each have their own history, personality, body, voice and agenda. And based on these things, they will each have a role and a story within the novel. Each of them will have a role within the main story, a story of their own, and an internal as well as an external journey. And these are the 3 things I'm going to be looking at. So first of all, every character in your novel will have a role in the main story. Even if they and the protagonist never meet, they will in some way affect the protagonist and the events that make up the protagonist's story, in that they will, accidentally or deliberately, help or hinder the protagonist's efforts to achieve his or her objective. So a character might affect the protagonist's chances of achieving their goal and therefore contribute to the main story by revealing new information, changing or challenging the protagonist's attitude or opinions, physically moving the protagonist closer or further away from their goal, making an existing problem worse, providing a solution to a problem, distracting the protagonist, or even pursuing the same objective and therefore becoming a rival. And some of these overlap, and there are of course many more. So you need to work out what role each character plays in the main story. What does he or she contribute to the protagonist's story? The main pitfall here is that a character is involved in the main story but doesn't actually play a vital role. As with events, the contribution made by a character to the progression of the main story needs to be necessary and unique. So if nothing a character does affects whether or not the protagonist achieves their objective, and the story would unfold and end in exactly the same way without them, that character will form a weak point in the story. You then need to ask yourself, can that character make a vital contribution to the story, or do they need to be cut out? Or if 2 characters make exactly the same contribution, are 2 needed, and it might be that multiple people are required to perform that task, or can one of them be given their own unique role, or do they need to be cut out? Developing your characters and their roles will strengthen your novel and make it a more compelling read. Unnecessary or poorly developed characters will weaken your story, because they will be less interesting to read about, and your reader will find it more difficult to care about them or what happens to them. Secondly, a character's own story. Your characters and their agendas and their roles should be so well written, in fact, that you or someone else who read your novel should be able to rewrite it, or at least part of it, from a different character's point of view and make it their story. Obviously, the more a character appears in the novel, the easier this would be. If you can't do this, it suggests that your characters aren't well developed enough and that they are only defined in relation to your protagonist, but don't each have their own identity and story. In which case you need to take them away and develop them and make them stronger and more individual, as outlined in session 4 on developing characters. However, you will also often find character stories in the subplot of a novel. So, what are subplots? What do they do? And how do you detect when they're not working properly? So what are they? Subplots are side stories which happen at the same time as the main story. They are tangents which don't initially move the main story on or directly show the protagonist getting closer or further away from achieving their objective, but which do eventually tie into the main story at or before the climax. They also generally involve other characters and may or may not involve the protagonist. What do they do? Subplots allow for the inclusion of other characters' stories and add depth, variety and complexity to a novel. They act as supports to the main story and help create intrigue and interest. And what are the common weaknesses concerning subplots? Number 1, it doesn't tie into the main story and therefore doesn't impact the outcome. Just because a subplot is included in the same novel doesn't mean it's tied into the main story. It needs to actually, at some point before the novel reaches its climax, make a direct contribution to the chain of events which make up the main story. Number 2, a subplot makes a contribution to the main story, but it isn't vital. In order for a subplot to do its job of supporting the main story, the contribution it makes needs to be vital, so that that subplot is necessary to the story you're telling. I.e., without that subplot, the main story would not unfold and end in the same way. If the main story would end in the same way without it, that subplot needs to be edited or taken out. Number 3, it overshadows your main story. If the events of the subplot are more exciting or take up more page space, it will take energy and focus away from your main story and weaken your novel. The main story needs to be just that, the main thing, the centre, the focus, and the subplot should be secondary to it. When working on a subplot which features or even centres around a character other than your protagonist, you need to think in terms of your character's agendas. So, what does each character want and what are they prepared to do to get it? The steps they then take in order to achieve that goal, or the events that occur that move them closer or further away from achieving their objective, will then form a separate story strand, a subplot to your main plot. So you need to work out how your subplot and your main plot intertwine. Ask yourself, how and when do the events of your subplot directly impact your main plot? I.e., they provide a development, however small, which moves the protagonist closer or further away from their objective. You could try drawing a line on a piece of paper showing the events of your main plot, a story arc, and then add another line in a different colour showing the events of your subplot. Where the events of the subplot don't affect the events of the main plot, the two lines would run parallel. And where the events of the subplot do affect the main plot, the two lines would connect. You could then mark on the paper what happens in the story at the points where the two lines meet, and how does it change the relationship between the protagonist and their objective? How does it move the protagonist closer or further away from achieving that goal? One of the pitfalls to be aware of here. Be wary of having a subplot which is quite long and takes up quite a lot of the novel, but doesn't intertwine or affect the main plot very often or until near the end of the story. If a subplot is well written and paced, a reader will persevere with it even if it isn't apparent why it's relevant to the main story. But if it goes on too long, without it being revealed how that subplot is going to impact the main story, the pace of the novel might begin to slow down, and the reader might lose patience and interest. And thirdly, internal journeys. What are they? An internal journey is how the character's thoughts and feelings change, for better or worse, between the beginning and the end of the book. Every character will have an internal as well as an external journey, or an internal as well as an external story. So as well as their actions and reactions, which will be external events, each character will have internal developments as a result of their experiences in the novel. How do they work? The internal and external journey of each character should of course be intertwined. Everything that happens to the characters will have some kind of effect on them, however big or small, and will cause them to think or feel something. And the best way to show these internal developments is to turn them into external actions, i.e. base a character's reaction, what they say or do, on exactly how they're feeling and thinking at that specific moment. Also, there are multiple levels of internal development. For the most part, the events of the story will spark an internal response in each character on a fairly superficial level. So they will think something or feel something as a result, but will fundamentally have the same personality and opinions. And therefore, most of the characters will, more or less, be the same at the end of the novel as they were at the beginning. However, some characters, it's unlikely to be all unless there are very few of them, might experience internal development on a deeper level. This might be because they experience a particular event which causes a more significant and long-term change, for example, a bereavement or a major revelation, or it might be that they change gradually over a period of time as a result of a series of events. Examples of this kind of internal development could be someone who questions their religious or political convictions, two people who fall in love, or a character who comes to terms with something from their past. A really good example of this is the character Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Through his experiences in the story, what he sees and hears, Scrooge has a dramatic change of heart, and this is revealed at the end of the story when he becomes a kind-hearted and generous man, and this is then demonstrated through external actions. And finally, how to avoid the pitfalls connected to internal journeys. Firstly, show, don't tell. Even if you're writing the first person, avoid telling your reader what the character is thinking or feeling. Look out for phrases like she thought and he felt. Where possible, limit these kinds of reflections and explanations and turn them into external actions, such as dialogue, body language, and movement. And also, having shown your reader how your character is thinking or feeling, don't then explain it to them as well. Have confidence in your writing and the intelligence of your reader that they will work these things out for themselves. Secondly, avoid too many ups and downs. Try not to have your character's moods swinging between different emotions unless a particular character is meant to be volatile and reactionary. Subtle emotional reactions are more realistic and often more intriguing. And if a character has an extreme emotional reaction, it will have less impact the next time they do this. And thirdly, don't rely on an internal journey. Finally, and most importantly, an internal journey should not be the main storyline. The 6 key aspects found in any story and the key events which show the protagonist getting closer or further away from their goal should be external and not internal developments. This is because internal developments tend to be more gradual and more subtle in order to be believable than external developments. It's better to have a series of external events which impact each character's internal development because they affect how the characters think and feel. But also, external events are a better way of revealing each character's internal journey to the reader. And that's because they show how the character is thinking or feeling and create a much stronger, more interesting, more lasting visual in the reader's mind, and therefore they have more impact. So, going back to your chapter by chapter breakdown, if you can pick out the main storyline, that's the protagonist's external journey, the 6 key aspects, that's the norm, the catalyst, the objective, the obstacle or obstacles, the climax and the resolution, the key events which show the protagonist getting closer and further away from achieving their objective as the story progresses to the climax, the subplots, and the internal journey of each character. And you can make sure that each part makes a vital contribution to the overall story and that it works as it should, you will be well on your way to editing your novel into a really good, compelling read. Next month, we'll be moving on to language and looking at how to choose just the right words to craft a really superb story in session 10. The video will be online from early April, or check out our website www.writeressentials.com for more information about the programme, including the next live session taking place in Edinburgh, our other services and resources, and how to donate to the production of these videos. Until next time, happy writing.